Well, I think what we haven't seen is evidence of withdrawal that has been claimed by the Kremlin. In fact, we've seen continued build-up of things like field hospitals and strategic weapon systems such as Iskander missiles deployed. So I think the reality is, I said last week when I visited Moscow, is that we'll take Russia at its word, but we'll judge them on their actions. And if we're going to build up trust to try and de-escalate this incident, what we need to make sure is that we're not building up troops at the same time. And that is still what we see. And until we see a proper de-escalation, I think we should all be cautious about the direction of travel from the Kremlin.
I mean, we have been told about naval drills. We've seen pictures, actually, of those naval drills in the Black Sea. At least those are pictures from yesterday. What is our latest intelligence?
Well, the latest intelligence is that basically there's over 100 battalion tactical groups of the Russian ground forces. That's 60% of the entire Russian land combat power on the borders of Ukraine, 130,000 plus troops, both in Belarus and indeed Ukraine, but also out at sea. There's effectively a significant flotilla of Russian amphibious landing ships and indeed warships and missile ships. And, from a Ukrainian point of view, they're fairly surrounded by a very large force of ready troops. And I think, that continues, they haven't taken the foot off the gas. Readiness is one of the first signs you always get about how serious a country is. And if you wanted to inflict intimidation on Ukraine, that deployment is doing exactly that. And I think that's why we're all here at NATO today and tomorrow to try and work together to reduce tensions and try and de-escalate. But, it's a very significant force. It's a force that would overwhelm Ukraine should it be deployed. And I think that's why we need to see clear de-escalation by the removal of troops at the same time as enter into discussion with Russia.
We were warned quite severely, and your boss, the Foreign Secretary, on the programme yesterday, saying that we could be at war today and that Brits needed to get out urgently from Ukraine. Were we failed by US intelligence?
Look, I've never talked about a date because in all the intelligence I've seen, that dates are not the issue. The issue here is the significant amount of forces. I've been a soldier. When you go on exercise, you don't set up huge amounts of blood banks and hospitals in the field. You don't move strategic weapon systems designed to protect other parts of Russia onto the edges of Ukraine. So the real indications here have not been a date. The real indications have been the gradual and steady and significant build-up of forces into a readiness posture and indeed into a deployment posture, which we've seen in the last few days, that would significantly indicate an incursion into Ukraine. Forces can only be held at readiness for so long. The Russians are better at it than most. They could hold those forces at readiness for weeks. So there's really no point speculating on a specific date. However, there are definitely dates in the mix, but I think it's unhelpful to speculate, because if you do, you get exactly the question you rightly asked, which is, well, if it wasn't today, has it all been wrong? I can tell you it hasn't been wrong. I can also tell you that, judge with your own eyes at the scale of that Russian deployment on the borders of Ukraine, and indeed all the press conferences by President Putin. It's pretty clear that their intentions towards Ukraine are to change their behavior and indeed change NATO's relationship with Ukraine, and they're doing so at the threat of invasion. And I think that's something that we as NATO are here to challenge and also to deter.
You say that troop placement, that troop deployment on the borders there, at least two borders, could overwhelm Ukraine if they moved into Ukraine. But the Foreign Affairs Select Committee Chair, Tom Tugendhat, himself a military man, saying that 130,000, 150,000 troops, whatever the number is nowhere near enough to cause problems, severe problems with Ukraine, certainly not to occupy it.
Well, there's a difference between invading and holding. 100 battalion tactical groups, hundreds of fighter aircraft, warships out at sea. The Russians have overwhelming forces over Ukraine, and if they really wish to inflict violence and invade, they could do that. The Ukrainians would put up a brave resistance. I made it very clear to the Russians the Ukrainians will fight, but those odds are overwhelming, and no one should delude themselves that they're not. And I respect Tom a lot, but I'm afraid he's wrong on the scale and the figures of the military forces on either side of the equation.
So what's your advice to Brits that are in Ukraine Should they be breathing a sigh of relief at the moment, or should they still be as anxious as they were this time yesterday?
I think, Kate, they should follow the Foreign Office advice, which is, we are in a position where we don't think President Putin has made a final decision, which is, again, why we think those forces are still poised at readiness. And until that decision is made and communicated by the Kremlin, I think the citizens, either dual nationals or British citizens in Ukraine, should continue to follow the well-considered Foreign Office advice and seek to either leave or avoid travel to Ukraine.
Chancellor Scholz speaking after he'd been to see President Putin, saying that he doesn't think that Ukraine should be allowed to join NATO. We also heard from General Richard Dannett, who used to be in charge of the army. As you know, he also said the same thing. Are they both speaking out of turn?
Well, I think my understanding of what Chancellor Scholz said was that it wasn't, NATO, Ukraine's succession to NATO was not on the agenda. Ukraine is on a path towards joining NATO, but a path that is obviously a very long-term path. They are currently an enhanced partner to NATO. But of course, NATO's fundamental policy is an open door policy, that we will accept applications and consider, as the 30 members, anyone who wishes to choose to join NATO. We do so in accordance with our values. That is a very important principle of NATO. NATO collectively reaffirmed that, including the Germans, only recently in the response to the Russian government. So that is the German position, it's the British position, and it's all 30 nations of NATO. So it's exactly the same, that we have an open door policy and we engage with those countries that wish to join us.
I wonder if you could clarify, words are important, of course. You said in the Sunday Times, a whiff of Munich. It caused quite a lot of upset at the time. What did you actually mean by that, Defence Secretary? Were you suggesting we're heading to World War III, or we should be concerned about appeasement?
Well, no, I think, so, Kay, what I said was if Ukraine was invaded, there would be a whiff of Munich. Because in the Munich conference with Adolf Hitler in the late 30s, there were two parts. So one was appeasement, was effectively where France and Britain were very worried in those days, obviously, about the consequence of a further war, having suffered through the First World War. And that is a long covered historical event. But the other part of the Munich was the clear deception by Adolf Hitler. He had a plan already to expand way beyond the parts of the Czech Republic he was after. It was effectively a deception. And while everyone was running after the straw man off this argument about just give me a little bit of border dispute resolution, he was planning a completely different agenda. And I've been very consistent on President Putin that I have felt that part of the argument about being encircled by NATO is in fact a straw man. I wrote an article a few weeks ago about that. And the danger is we all coalesce around this argument, while all along, if he invades Ukraine, it will have been a clear sign that he had a plan all along. And what we're seeing at the moment is a clear plan. I mean, he has massed thousands of forces on another country's borders, and that doesn't quite look like the fears he has about NATO, given that Ukraine is not in NATO. It looks like a similarity. So that was what I was trying to say. Okay. I did say, I think some of the media took a different angle on it.
OK. We must let you go, Defence Secretary. I know it's a very busy time for you. Thank you very much indeed for sparing the time to join us on Sky.
Thank you. Thank you.